Our first In Conversation With session is, for me, a key piece of the program that we're bringing to you today. Bart de Witte, who's the founder of Hippo AI and has really created groundbreaking work in the area of open health by creating data standards that weren't existing before and trying to revolutionize how we see health and how we treat our data accordingly, is going to be in conversation with Nick Couldry, who is a professor at London's LSE and has coined the term datacolonialism and brought forth such important concepts about the way that we think about our personal data and how we should govern it as a society in future. I'm so excited to pass the stage over to you, Bart and Nick, for your conversation on Data is Life.
Hi, my name is Bart de Witte. I'm the founder from the Hippo AI Foundation, and my mission is to open source medical artificial intelligence by creating data and AI commons. I'm your host for today. The following is a conversation with Nick Couldry from the London School of Economics. Nick, I was looking forward for this moment to have this conversation, so I'm very excited. And before we get into our topic that is both or leading or most taking over control of our life, what we are doing, I have a warm-up question. So I ask this to everyone, and there is no right or wrong answer. But what do you think of when you hear the word Hippo?
Well, there are two answers. One is Hippo is a recycling company in the UK, and it's the name of Hippo is on every recycling plant in Britain. So that's one thing I think of. Also, it made me think of St. Augustine, the great Christian philosopher, who was born or lived in Hippo in North Africa. So there's an important, and of course, he was one of he was the first person to really think of the interrogation of the self. So he's very important in thinking about the freedom of the self.
This is why I asked that question. I learned so many new aspects about the word hippo. I also learned that the person with the highest income is also called a hippo. So all different things. So hippos are everywhere. But now, very seriously, coming to your work, you have been probably making the life of some people very uncomfortable, and you have been very vocal during your public discussions, and more specifically in the book that you co-authored with Ulysses Mejias of the State University of New York, called The Cost of Connection, that I can recommend all the listeners to buy and read, because it's an eye-opening book for me. You mentioned that we are witnessing today in the digital economy is a turning point in humanity. You also going one step further as the concept of Shoshana Zuboff which she described in her book Surveillance Capitalism, because you are suggesting that the current power asymmetries between the digital data-driven platforms and the users will pave the way of a new stage of capitalism with outlines we only partly can see. And you call it the capitalization of life without limit. You mentioned, and I quote, that there will be no part of human life, there will be no layer of experience that is not extractable for economical value, and human life will be there for mining by corporations without reserve. You mentioned that this process of capitalization will be the foundation of a highly unequal new social arrangement, end quote. During my discussions in my work, I've quoted you many times. I think it's over 100, and I even lost friends quoting you. I had a friend who has an AI-based company that he sells as AI for good in Africa. He's extracting data, but he's creating value, economical value in Berlin. I also quoted this quite loud during an AI for Good conference in Geneva, where Google presented their AI-based solutions for health in India, where, out of my point of view, they were doing social experiments with very poor people, giving them access to some kind of detection system. And I called it as well datacolonialism. So very short question before we deep into the topic, but I saw the reactions. How do you deal with the reactions bringing such a strong term? Because it is not a term that everybody wants to hear and discuss about.
Well, yes, it does provoke strong reactions. It is sensitive, and we can see why if we compare it with Shoshana Zuboff's very important thesis of surveillance capitalism, which I admire very much, and we have a lot in common with. But at its core, even though it seems very broad, Zuboff is basically saying there's a set of rogue capitalists, Google, Facebook, and the like, who've gone down a bad branch path, a variant of capitalism, which is wrong because it seizes surveillance assets from human beings. We need to reform them, and then we can get back on the path of capitalism, which is basically good, which, if insofar as it uses data, it does so for a valid purpose of personalizing services. That, in our view, misses the bigger picture, the even bigger picture, which is that the benign language of data capture, which we hear in every sector, from agriculture to health to education today, the benign capture of data as a social good needs to be rethought in terms of a much longer history of capture. And that history is the history of colonialism. And that's a fact about history. It's not our invention. That 500 years ago, roughly, two powers, Spain and Portugal, followed them by Holland and Britain, saw that it was possible to capture the earth's resources, the land, the resources in the land, the bodies to work the land. And we're arguing we're now at the beginning of an equally significant new epoch, the epoch of datacolonialism, where a new thing is seized, which is human life itself. And the big data is the language for that capture. That is designed to be provocative because it's designed to open us to see the meaning of that if we take into account those parallels. And it is quite shocking because, as we know, historical colonialism was the start of a massive new inequality on a geopolitical scale, which created the world basically as an unequal space.
Why do you call it? Because if I look into data is for some people bits and bytes. It is not alive. It is a recording. Why do you call it that it's capitalization of life, human life? How can you create a digital, very abstract bits and bytes and are connected to human life?
Well, at the fundamental level, and health brings this out very well, the accounts we give, the stories we can give, the information we can give out about our life are fundamental to that life. We can be damaged by the bad information that circulates about our life. Crucial health information about us, the nature of our genome sequence, is the core of the information relevant to our life. So if it goes into the wrong hands, that's extremely dangerous. So therefore, we can't ignore the consequences of information for life, particularly not health information. And I think in a real sense, to capture data from life is, in a broadest sense, to capture life itself, because it is to capture all the parameters of what can be said and known about that particular life. So another way of looking at it from the other end, from the corporate end, is that for the first time in human history, about 30, 40 years ago, it became possible for large corporations of all sorts, to have a different relation to human life. Before, human life was there as a set of consumers, a set of users of services. It did what it did. If it connected with corporations, that was great. If it didn't, it didn't. But because of the emergence of the internet, and particularly the intranet, as an input, a direct input to business, it became possible for corporations to imagine that life was part of the corporate process. It was a direct input to that process. And that is a radically new historical possibility. And that is the root of the idea of big data, which we see celebrated everywhere. So that's why we talk about the capitalization of life without limit, because basically, if you imagine that human life exists within the corporate domain, it's not separated from it in its own space. It exists, it grows, it develops within the corporate domain for capture. Then there are no limits to what corporations can do with that. It is a capture from the beginning, in advance. That's why we call it capitalization of life without limit. It's a fundamental shift in human history and power relations between human beings and corporations.
That's quite interesting and very insightful. Like what we did in the foundation is a lot of people are these metaphors. Data is a new oil, and data is a commodity, and we see data in healthcare as a reflection of human life, because we are in a very early stage of digitalization, but the further we move, when it will be in quantum computing or whatever kind of simulation we will be able to replicate, then somebody can make an exact copy of yourself. And then this is a reflection of your human life. The other part what we are looking at is why it's human life, because in that data are also the solutions for finding answers on diseases. And if somebody extracts that data and owns that data and owns these answers, then you also own human life, because then you have an asymmetric power relationship between the corporate and the society that is looking then for cures. Is there, I want to go a bit more into the framing of the term data colonialism, and is data monetization or looking at data as a commodity in healthcare the same then as data colonialism, or are there differences there in your concept?
Well, commodification is what enables the capitalist economy to operate. That was Marx's theory 150 years ago, and it's still broadly correct today, that by things being able to be exchanged on the market for value, they enter the possibility, they enter the capitalist economy. That's commodification. So monetization of data, many of these proposals, which we'll come on to, that you should be able to receive money for your personal data, they in effect normalize data as a commodity. And that is a precondition for data colonialism. It's not the same as the land grab, which is what we mean by data colonialism, but it's a key precondition. And therefore, I think we need to be really careful about the idea that, for example, we should be selling our personal data, our health data, because that's commodifying it, which is exactly incorporating it within the capitalist economy, when your important metaphor, data is human life, is a way of saying, no, it must be more than that. I think the phrase data is human life is very interesting, because in one sense, it's not true, because human life is more than data. Human life is a natural phenomenon on the earth that's emerged over billions of years. Data is a highly precise construction within very particular infrastructures of storing data, transferring data, counting things on computers, which is an emergence just in the last few seconds, as it were, of human history. It's highly artificial. So in that sense, data is not human life. But you get to the core of the issue with your phrase, though, because in another way, capturing the data that is generated from human life is the same as capturing life itself. It's capturing all the informational possibilities of life, which are vital for the development of that life, both on a moral, civic level, but as you say, at a health level as well. So I agree with your phrase, if we translate it that way. Absolutely, data is human life in that sense, and therefore we must take care of it, and we must treat it as something of greater value than the economy, fundamental to the possibility of a good economy.
Yeah, and there are already AI-based services. Like there was a company called Replica.ai that was derived out of a story of somebody losing her friend, and then she took all the communication data and she created a replica of a communication chatbot that was about that reacting just as a deceased person. And now she created a startup around that you can replicate yourself. Now, I've looked at the terms and conditions of that startup. You can retract the data, but you don't own the model itself. And that means that there is something that is behaving like you, that is trained on your data, that is already feels like it's alive if you put pause a Turing test. But it is a reflection of you, but you don't own it. And that's exactly what you point out. Like we are in that sense, in a digital world, taking ownership of part of your life. And that's one of the without limits, that's one of these directions where this is heading to in a sense. So we see that in deep fake porno movies as well, where faces of celebrities are being used, where suddenly that's also data that is being used to act it in a very different way.
Well, if I could just comment on that. I mean, one can comment on that philosophically, because we know that data is used to predict. We know that marketers have ambitions to predict our reactions, our emotions on the basis of the data they already have about our past. So it's not just about the present. Philosophically, we're now entering to a new area where it hasn't until recently been necessary to talk about this question of ownership. Hegel, 200 years ago, said in an astonishing way that our body is our property. Mm-hmm. We own our body. It's a very jarring, strange phrase because, of course, we don't literally. That's not legally true. It's not politically true. We don't think that way. But what Hegel was trying to get at is that for the very possibility of existence as a human being in the world, there's a material basis of that, which includes the body, but including the mind, of course. And therefore, what we experience through our bodies, our embodied minds, is in that sense, we can call it our property, but he says it's inalienable. It's the one property you cannot give away and still be that human being.
I think that's where our fundamental rise of dignity and integrity exactly to protect it. We have fought for this to protect it, and now we are copying it into a digital realm where we're going to have to fight again for our digital rights, which should actually be the same as our analog rights.
But what is so interesting is that Hegel said this 200 years ago because he was trying to get to the fundamental roots of freedom. He was a fundamental thinker. He never imagined this would be a problem. The only case he thinks of people who lose control of that fundamental property are slaves. In a footnote to that comment, he says slaves have lost this, but everyone else has this basic freedom. Now we are encountering a moment in history where that property over the information flow of your life, which is what we experience as our life, is at stake in a corporate game, and including the genomic sequence that underlies all those possibilities. So this is a sign that we're entering really fundamental philosophical territory here.
But if you compare it to colonialism, I used in my naive days in 2008, I used the service 23andMe because I wanted to find out where my ancestors came from and which diseases. I was a quantified selver and I wanted to quantify everything. I read the term and conditions, yes. But at that time, during those days, the terms and conditions can always be changed. I still had to pay over €1,000 to get my data sequenced, and I was still not a product. But then the business model changed, and the terms and conditions changed. Consequently, I pulled back my data, but I think I'm one of the 0.1 users out there. But if you compare it to colonialism, nobody, I think, for my knowledge, asked consent. But in these platforms, you have to give consent. Isn't that the difference between colonialism and data colonialism, that there is this legal step where we give consent for people to process our data?
Well, this is an important point, and it's something that makes people sometimes puzzled about why we're talking about data colonialism here. So we have to put it in a bit of historical context. So what we're saying is colonial is the land grab, the taking of the asset. Originally, it was land. Now it is human life itself in the form of data. That's where we say the comparison occurs. So let's grant, if you grant that for a second, how can this be done? 500 years ago, the colonialists went out to the Americas, which they didn't know exist until they found it. And they had no social relations whatsoever with the people they found there. Nothing. They recognized them as human beings, that was all. They therefore only had two means to grab the gold and the silver, which was brute violence and lying, pretending to do something else while taking the gold and silver. And they did both. They did both. Now, however, the new colonialism, if that's what it is emerging on the basis not just of 500 years of colonialism, but 200 to 300 years of capitalism. The highly organized configuration of social relations around profit, around commodification. And that's why today violence, physical violence, isn't necessary to achieve a new colonial end. We just need to tweak the terms, the legal terms that govern the operation of our mobile phone devices. And we can already achieve the transfer of rights that is necessary for the colonial appropriation, because this is now happening on the basis of capitalism. That's the reason the violence isn't there. That's the reason we have something like consent, but it isn't really consent because people don't know what it is they're consenting to. They're consenting to some future, it's the capture of a future, the capture of the future of their data, which is by definition unknowable at that point in the present. So it's never a full consent given.
It is never informed consent.
Never informed consent, not at least as it normally operates, but there may be ways that socially we can ground consent in a different way, and I'm sure we'll come back to that.
The replica example that I gave you, if you go on the terms and conditions, the privacy terms, the last sentence is written that these terms can always be changed again. So, yeah. And that you have to regularly check if they are. And I know this from lawyers in the merger and acquisition space, that without putting this on there, they will have problems exiting the company, the startup. And with the exit, you sell the most valuable asset, which is then the data in terms of the acquisition strategies. Okay, we're talking about, I think I understood your concept, but now the solution, because we can always talk about all these radical approaches that Facebook started with, but what are these, and we're going to go deeper into that, but how do you then decolonize already colonized data, or does it start by creating an alternative system? How do you decolonize this world from these data platforms?
Well, what we're saying, and this is another implication of the data colonialism phrase, is that it's a whole social and economic order being built here around this capture of data. It's a fundamental transformation. So we can't dismantle it by me stopping to use Facebook or me refusing to enter into this genetic sequencing option that I might have. It has to be done collectively. And it's a matter really of thinking about what would a genuine social consent to the gathering of data for genuine social purposes be. Because if we're saying that in general, capturing a life's data stream as a default option, which is, I fear, where we're moving to very much with some of the rhetoric from the EU and many corporations and so on. If the default option is that your data is captured, it exists within the corporate domain, therefore life is captured, then we need to think about, can we imagine situations where there are purposes where we need data to be gathered, let's say to cure a disease, where everyone in the society would agree with that goal. They would understand the purposes of the data use. They would have transparent access to the modalities of that data use. They would have the chance to refuse consent if they change their mind. And there will be an ongoing social debate, really central to society's functioning, because health is at the core of society's continuing at all, which would be the ground, the basis of saying there is social consent to this particular use of this particular type of health data. And that would be unproblematic because it would be as it were the community saying, we together want to give this thing we all have together, which is the information generated by our living together, into a common pool to be used for our common purposes.
Which is very similar to what I'm doing with
Exactly.
my
That
data.
would be valid,
And
yes.
then licensing them for creating what I then call open knowledge. The difficulty here is we live in a world where people don't care if they send text messages from A to B and if others sell their data as long as it's for free. But these same people, if you would ask them to send a letter by a postal service that is free, but this postal letter is then being opened and copied and then being sold, most probably nobody would use that because it's a letter and it would be open, and that should not be opened. Like the way of thinking in the analog world is very different than the way of thinking in a digital world. And I figured it completely out, but I think it's partly a lack of education. But at the same time, if these things come for free and the industry always hacks the human psychology in terms of giving him consent by always giving something back, how do you deal then with creating a movement? Because that's my challenge. We started social media campaigns, and this will take a very long time until we get there. But like, how do you close that gap from our behavior that is so much different in the analog world as in that digital space out there? Is that going to close by itself?
No. Well, I think it's a matter of social imagination. I mean, that's the reason that Ulysses Macias and I wrote this book, The Cost of Connection, which is to try and start a debate in society about how we imagine living in a connected way, because we want to be connected, but on different terms, without this default data extraction. And that's an act of the historical imagination, the social imagination. And that's difficult because I think another aspect of what's changing as part of this new data-fied social order is that what we call society isn't the same as society was before this order came into being. We still carry in our heads the idea that we have our bodies, we move around in space, we touch each other. Yeah, we touch computers as well and put inputs into a computer system, and somehow magically that involves the transfer of information somewhere we can't see it, but we like it when it happens and we don't like it when it doesn't happen. That's our view of the social world on a daily basis. What we can't grasp, and we need to grasp, is that social space now operates through forms of power between every point and every other point. It's not a matter of the king sitting on his seat, ruling us from one point in space. Computers are the source of government, of order, of power. And everything we carry has a computer in it. And every computer potentially can govern other computers because of the basic structure of the internet. So the nature of the space we live in is radically transformed in the past 30 years. It's a point-to-point space of power with radically much higher dimensional forms of power operating in it than the old version we were thinking of until around 1990. And we haven't got used to this yet. We need to think about that. But one way to think about that is to think about positive versions of that. Maybe it would be positive if each of us were to contribute the data that could be consensually gathered from the operations of our heart, as a way of monitoring the risks, what causes the risks of heart disease. It might be something we would all consent to increase our knowledge as human beings, and something we could only do through this new, radically new, data-fied social space that we're living in. But if we could start to imagine positive possibilities, that would get clearer bad possibilities as well. So I think it's very important to think about positive uses of this new space of connection, because then we'll start to be clear about what we definitely don't want, the sort of powers we definitely don't want corporations or governments to have in this radically new social space we're living in today.
What happened between 2001 and now? Because in 2001, and this is quite funny and surprising that I ever would quote these two persons. I was not a huge fan of their policies. But Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, they fought back against companies that were worth billions already in venture capital investments, and they were not on the stock exchange yet, that were patenting the human genome. And they decided to regulate the human genome and make it a common good. Because, and in that speech, they said, like, this is for the sake of humanity and the progress of society, we need to keep this a common good. And I asked myself, what happened since 2001 that a Bill Clinton and Tony Blair were telling this kind of story, where today we have Ursula von der Leyen going for the opposite? I don't get it. Why is there nobody? Is it becoming too complex? Is it because of the power becoming so strong what is your opinion that we have such a discrepancy between back then and now?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the result of moving away from your fundamental principle that data is human life. It is what emerges in the space of information from life. It is the future and the present of life, which is the natural default position. It's what human beings would naturally say, because we all know information in our own life. What I know about my life is my life, is what I remember about it, what I share about. That is my life. That's the natural default position. But what's taken over is a discourse, I would call it an ideology, which Yuval Harari, the historian, calls a dataism. Others call it dataism, which is the idea that data is the means of controlling life. Every data must be gathered from life so that life can be governed and controlled in the interests of power. This has been developed within market ideologies in the United States, developed within communist, different non-market ideologies within China. Europe is potentially in the middle of this. It does have the potential to offer something different. But at the moment, it looks like it's orientating itself more to the market discourse. It's not offering anything different, although all the European legislation says that everything should be done in accordance with the European values. Mm-hmm. I'm not clear what those European values are. They don't seem to be very clearly articulated in the proposed legislation, except some limited reference to some controls under using human rights, but that's not sufficient to deal with the social challenges here. So what's going on is really the capture of life by a dataist discourse, which argues that power over data will become the new form of power over life. And that's what social beings, that's what citizens have to challenge. It's only taken 20 years to do it. It can be reversed then in the next 20 years.
Wow, these were powerful words, and I think as a ending of our conversation, I leave it like this. I could go and touch on other topics, but dear Nick, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for being courageous. Thank you for your work, which is inspiring for me. I feel really honored and thankful that you allowed me to have this conversation, and I hope our audience will enjoy, spread it, because I think it is high noon that we start thinking about the utopias. So let's create them together. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bart, and I admire your work, and I'm sure my co-author Ulysses Mejias would have loved to be part of the conversation too, if that had been possible. Good luck in your work.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you.